The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the general store in Winnetka, California, and Adelaide Emerson stepped down onto dusty ground with nothing but a worn carpet bag, her mother's ring sewn into the hem of her dress, and a letter from a man she had never met promising her a home in the mountains. The year was 1873, and the gold rush had brought all kinds of people west. But Adelaide had come for something more precious than gold. She had come because staying in Boston meant marrying a banker twice her age who smelled of cigars and spoke to her like she was a piece of furniture to be acquired. The journey from Boston had taken weeks, and every mile had given her time to second-guess her decision. She was 22 years old, educated enough to read and write beautifully, and desperate enough to answer an advertisement in the Boston Herald from a mountain man seeking a wife. His letter had been simple and direct, written in surprisingly neat handwriting that spoke of a cabin in the Sierra Nevada mountains, a life of hard work, and a promise to treat her with respect and kindness. He had signed it Vernon Owens, and something about the straightforwardness of his words had touched her heart in a way that all the flowery courtship of Boston society never had. Winnetka was smaller than she had expected, just a scattering of wooden buildings along a single main street with the mountains rising like ancient sentinels in the distance. The air smelled of pine and dust, and the July heat was dry and intense, so different from the humid summers of Massachusetts. Adelaide smoothed her traveling dress and looked around, searching for a man who fit the description Vernon had given her in his letters. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell past his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. A woman emerged from the general store, wiping her hands on her apron and regarding Adelaide with open curiosity. "You must be the mail-order bride everyone's been talking about," she said, her voice friendly despite the bluntness of her words. "Vernon Owens is intended. I'm Martha Sullivan. My husband and I run the store here." Adelaide felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the California sun. "Is it so obvious?" Martha laughed, a warm sound that put Adelaide slightly at ease. "Honey, in a town this size, a new face is news before the stagecoach even stops moving. Besides, Vernon told my husband you'd be arriving this week. He's been coming down from his cabin every day for the past 5 days, watching for the stage." The thought of this man she had never met checking for her arrival each day sent a flutter through Adelaide's stomach. "Is he here now?" "Should be. He was here an hour ago, probably over at the saloon, though he doesn't drink much. It's the only place in town where folks gather to talk." Martha gestured down the street to a building with a painted sign that read, "Lucky Dollar Saloon." "Come on, I'll walk you over. You must be exhausted from your journey." Adelaide followed Martha down the wooden sidewalk, acutely aware of the eyes watching from windows and doorways. She clutched her carpet bag tighter, feeling the small weight of her mother's ring through the fabric of her dress. The ring was all she had left of her mother, who had died when Adelaide was 16, and her father had followed 2 years later, leaving Adelaide at the mercy of an aunt who saw her as nothing more than a burden to be married off as quickly as possible. The saloon was dim inside after the bright sunlight, and it took Adelaide's eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, she saw him immediately. Vernon Owens stood at the far end of the bar, and he was everything his letters had suggested and more. He was massive, easily over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they strained against his flannel shirt. His arms were thick with muscle, the kind that came from years of hard physical labor, and his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee looked like they could break timber with ease. His dark hair fell in waves past his collar, tied back loosely with a leather cord, and his face was rugged and weathered, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days of beard growth. When he turned and saw her, his storm-gray eyes widened slightly, and Adelaide felt something shift in her chest, like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed. He moved toward her with surprising grace for such a large man, and up close, Adelaide had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. He stopped a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands, and she could see the uncertainty in his expression, as if he too was wrestling with the strangeness of meeting someone who would become his wife, based on nothing more than letters and a leap of faith. "Miss Emerson," he said, and his voice was deep and rough, like stones rolling in a river. "I'm Vernon Owens. I hope your journey was not too difficult." Adelaide found her voice, though it came out softer than she intended. It was long, but I'm here now. And please, call me Adelaide. Something in his expression softened at that, a hint of relief crossing his features. Adelaide, he repeated, as if testing the name on his tongue. I'm glad you came. I know this must all be very strange for you. It is strange for both of us, I think, Adelaide said, managing a small smile. She noticed how carefully he held himself, as if conscious of his size and strength, and it touched her that this powerful man was so clearly trying not to frighten her. Martha cleared her throat. I'll leave you two to get acquainted. Adelaide, if you need anything at all, you know where to find me. After Martha left, Vernon gestured to a table in the corner. Would you like to sit? We should talk before we head up to the cabin. It is about a 2-hour ride into the mountains, and I want to make sure you know what you are getting into. I would not want you to feel trapped. They sat, and Adelaide set her carpet bag beside her chair. The saloon was mostly empty at this time of day, just a few men playing cards in the far corner who kept glancing over with obvious curiosity. Vernon seemed oblivious to them, his attention focused entirely on Adelaide. My cabin is not fancy, he began, his fingers turning his hat in circles on the table. It is solid and warm, and I have built it well, but it is simple. One main room with a sleeping loft, a good stove, a creek nearby for water. I hunt and trap, trade furs in town, and have a small garden. The winters are hard up there. We get snowed in for weeks at a time. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away. It is a lonely life, and I will not pretend otherwise. Adelaide listened carefully, watching his face as he spoke. There was an honesty to him that she appreciated, a straightforwardness that was refreshing after years of navigating the subtle deceits of Boston society. Why did you want a wife, Vernon? Truly. He met her eyes, and she saw something vulnerable there beneath the rugged exterior. Because I am tired of being alone. I am 30 years old, and I have spent the last 8 years in these mountains with no company but my own thoughts and the occasional visit to town. I built my cabin thinking I would find a woman to share it with, but the kind of women who come west are usually already spoken for or looking for gold miners and ranchers, not mountain men who spend half the year tracking through snow. I want a partner, Adelaide, someone to build a life with, someone to come home to. Is that foolish? No, Adelaide said softly. It is not foolish at all. I came here for much the same reason. I was facing a future in Boston that felt like a cage, and your letters offered me something different. Freedom, in a way. A chance to build something real. Vernon's shoulders relaxed slightly. Then we want the same things. That's a good start. There is something I need to tell you, Adelaide said, her hand moving unconsciously to the hem of her dress where her mother's ring was hidden. I brought very little with me, but I have one possession that matters a great deal. My mother's ring. It was hers and her mother's before that. It is the only thing of value I own, and I could not leave it behind. Vernon's expression grew serious. May I see it? Adelaide hesitated only a moment before reaching into the hem of her dress and working the small stitches loose. The ring fell into her palm, a simple gold band with a small sapphire stone that caught the light. It was not ostentatious, but it was beautiful in its simplicity, and holding it brought back a flood of memories of her mother's gentle hands and kind smile. Vernon looked at the ring but did not reach for it. It is beautiful. Your mother had good taste. She was wonderful, Adelaide said, her throat tight. I wish you could have known her. Tell me about her, Vernon said. We have time before we need to leave. So Adelaide told him about her mother, about her love of gardens and poetry, about how she had died of pneumonia one bitter winter, about how Adelaide's father had never quite recovered from the loss. Vernon listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment before speaking. Wear it on our wedding day, he said, if you would like to, a way to have her there with you. The simple kindness of those words hit Adelaide like a physical force, and she felt tears prick her eyes. In Boston, the banker her aunt wanted her to marry had insisted she sell any jewelry she owned to contribute to the household expenses. He had seen her mother's ring as nothing more than a small asset to be liquidated. But Vernon, this mountain man she had just met, understood that some things were worth more than their monetary value. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." Vernon nodded, then stood. "We should get going if we want to reach the cabin before dark. I have supplies to load onto the pack horse. The general store is holding them for me." Adelaide carefully sewed the ring back into her dress hem, then followed Vernon out into the bright afternoon sun. At the hitching post stood 2 horses and a mule loaded with supplies. The larger of the 2 horses was a massive bay gelding that suited Vernon perfectly, and the smaller was a pretty chestnut mare with a white blaze on her forehead. "That is Copper," Vernon said, nodding to the mare. "She is yours if you want her. I bought her a month ago thinking you would need your own mount. She has a gentle temperament and sure feet on mountain trails." Adelaide approached the mare slowly, letting Copper smell her hand before stroking the soft nose. "She is lovely. Thank you." "Can you ride?" Vernon asked, though there was no judgment in the question. "I learned as a girl, though it has been some years. I will manage." Vernon helped her mount, his large hands steadying her with careful strength, and then swung up onto his own horse with practiced ease. They rode out of Winnetka with Martha waving from the doorway of the general store and curious eyes watching from every window. The trail into the mountains started gently but grew steeper as they climbed, winding through groves of pine and oak that provided welcome shade from the summer heat. Vernon led the way, frequently glancing back to make sure Adelaide was managing, and after the first hour, they stopped at a small stream to water the horses and rest. Adelaide dismounted, grateful for the chance to stretch her legs. The mountains were breathtaking, wild and vast in a way that made her feel both small and somehow more alive. "It is beautiful here," she said as Vernon handed her a canteen. "Wait until you see the view from the cabin," Vernon said. "On clear days, you can see for 50 miles. They continued climbing, and Adelaide found herself watching Vernon as much as the scenery. The way he moved, so comfortable in this wild place, spoke of a man completely at home in his environment. He pointed out landmarks and trails, a deer watching them from a rocky outcrop, an eagle soaring overhead. He spoke about the mountains with an intimacy that came from years of living among them, and Adelaide began to understand that this was not just where Vernon lived, it was part of who he was. The sun was starting its descent when they finally emerged into a clearing, and Adelaide caught her breath. The cabin sat nestled against the mountainside, built of sturdy logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch that faced west, toward a vista that seemed to stretch to the edge of the world. Behind the cabin, pine trees climbed higher up the mountain, and in front, the land sloped down through meadows dotted with wildflowers. A stream gurgled somewhere nearby, the sound of it peaceful and constant. "Home," Vernon said simply, and Adelaide could hear the pride in his voice. They dismounted, and Vernon began unloading the mule while Adelaide walked slowly toward the cabin. It was larger than she had expected from his description, and clearly built with care. The logs were perfectly fitted, the roof solid, and the windows had real glass in them, which was a luxury in such a remote place. Vernon opened the door and stepped back to let Adelaide enter first. Inside, the cabin was indeed simple, but not crude. The main room had a large stone fireplace, a sturdy table with chairs, shelves lined with supplies and books, and a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove. A ladder led up to a sleeping loft, and Adelaide could see quilts and furs covering what must be the bed. Everything was clean and organized, and the smell of pine and wood smoke permeated the space. "It is wonderful," Adelaide said, and meant it. "You have built a real home here, Vernon." She saw pleasure flash across his face at her words. "I'm glad you think so. I know it is not what you are used to coming from Boston." "Boston had bigger houses and fancier furnishings," Adelaide said, "but this feels more honest somehow, more real." Vernon set down the supplies he had been carrying and cleared his throat. "About the sleeping arrangements. I want you to know that I will sleep down here, on a bedroll by the fire, until after we are properly married. I know you agreed to come here to be my wife, but I will not presume anything. You can have the loft and your privacy until you are ready." Adelaide felt warmth spread through her chest at his consideration. "When were you thinking we would marry?" "There is a circuit preacher who comes through these parts once a month. He is due in Winnetka in 3 days. If you are willing, we could marry then. But if you need more time, to be sure, I will understand." Adelaide thought about this. 3 days was hardly any time at all, But what would waiting longer accomplish? She had already made her choice when she boarded the stagecoach in Boston. She had already decided to trust this man with her future. And standing in this cabin, watching him try so hard to do right by her, she felt more certain than she had about anything in years. 3 days is fine, she said. I would like to wear my mother's ring, as you suggested. Vernon's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, transforming his rugged face into something almost boyish. Then in 3 days, you will be Adelaide Owens if you will have me. I will have you, Vernon Owens, Adelaide said, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity and growing familiarity. Vernon showed Adelaide everything about the cabin and the surrounding area where he kept the food stores, how to work the stove, which trails were safe and which were dangerous, where the best fishing spots were in the creek. He taught her to recognize the tracks of deer, bear, and mountain lion, and impressed upon her the importance of never going far from the cabin alone until she knew the land better. Adelaide, in turn, brought her own skills to the partnership. She organized the cabin more efficiently, mended tears in Vernon's clothes that he'd been ignoring, and cooked meals that were far more elaborate than the simple fare he had been making for himself. She found his small collection of books, and they spent the evenings reading aloud to each other by firelight, Vernon's deep voice stumbling occasionally over poetry, but growing more confident as the nights progressed. They talked endlessly during those 3 days, sharing their histories and hopes. Adelaide learned that Vernon had come west after his parents died of cholera, seeking a new start away from the painful memories of his childhood farm in Missouri. He had tried his hand at mining first, but found he preferred the solitude and challenge of mountain life to the chaos of the mining camps. He had built the cabin with his own hands over the course of a year, carefully selecting each tree and stone, determined to create something lasting. Vernon learned that Adelaide loved botany and had dreams of cultivating a proper garden in the meadow below the cabin. She told him about the books she had read, the poems she had memorized, the loneliness of living with an aunt who saw her as a burden. She confessed her fears about being so far from civilization and her excitement about building a life on her own terms. On the morning of the 3rd day, they rode back down to Winnetka together. Adelaide wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes, and Vernon had trimmed his beard and brushed his long hair until it shone. More importantly, Adelaide wore her mother's ring on a chain around her neck, tucked beneath her dress where she could feel it against her skin. The wedding took place in the small church at the edge of town, with Martha and her husband as witnesses and half of Winnetka in attendance, because there was not much entertainment to be had, and a wedding was always cause for celebration. The circuit preacher, a thin man with kind eyes named Reverend Walters, kept the ceremony brief and meaningful. When it came time for rings, Vernon pulled out a simple gold band from his pocket. I had the blacksmith make this, he said quietly, sliding it onto Adelaide's finger. It is not fancy, but it is strong, like what I hope our marriage will be. Adelaide's throat was tight as she removed her mother's ring from the chain around her neck. She had decided that morning that she wanted Vernon to have it, to keep the tradition going in a new way. This was my mother's, she said, her voice thick with emotion, and now I give it to you, to wear if you would like, as a symbol that you are part of that legacy of love. Vernon's eyes widened, and she saw moisture glinting there as he held out his hand. The ring was too small for his thick fingers, but it fit on his smallest finger, and he looked at it with an expression of wonder. I will treasure this, he said, and I will treasure you, Adelaide. I promise you that. Then we are married, Reverend Walters declared, and may God bless this union. Vernon cupped Adelaide's face in his large, calloused hands and kissed her gently, carefully, as if she were something precious and fragile. Adelaide kissed him back, tasting coffee and hope, and when they pulled apart, she saw her own emotions reflected in his gray eyes, nervousness, joy, and the tentative beginning of something deeper. The townspeople threw a small celebration in the saloon, with music and dancing and food brought by various families who wanted to welcome the new bride to their community. Adelaide danced with Vernon, who moved with surprising grace despite his size, and with several of the other men in town who wanted to meet the woman who had come all the way from Boston to marry their mysterious mountain man neighbor. Martha pulled Adelaide aside at one point and pressed a package into her hands. Just a few things for your new home, Martha said with a wink, "and some advice, though you did not ask for it. That man looks at you like you hung the moon. Be patient with each other, especially in the beginning. Marriage is hard work, but it is good work." Adelaide thanked her and tucked the package into her saddlebag, curious about its contents, but knowing she would wait until they were back at the cabin to investigate. As the sun began to set, Vernon touched her elbow gently. "Should we head back? I want to get you home before dark." Home. The word sent a shiver of anticipation through Adelaide. They said their goodbyes and mounted their horses, riding out of Winnetka as husband and wife. The journey back up the mountain seemed shorter this time, or perhaps Adelaide was simply more aware of what waited at the end of it. She watched Vernon's broad back as he rode ahead of her, this man who was now her husband, and felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement that made her hands tremble slightly on the reins. When they reached the cabin, Vernon helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist for a moment before he stepped back to tend to the horses. Adelaide went inside and lit the lamps, then opened Martha's package. Inside were 2 fine linen nightgowns, clearly meant for a bride, along with lavender soap, a small bottle of perfume, and a note that simply said, "Be happy." Adelaide changed into one of the nightgowns in the loft, her hands shaking slightly as she brushed out her long, dark hair. She could hear Vernon moving around below, banking the fire and checking the door locks. When she climbed down the ladder, he was standing by the fireplace, staring into the flames, and he had changed into clean trousers and a shirt with the sleeves rolled up to expose his muscular forearms. He turned when he heard her, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. There was desire there, certainly, but also tenderness and uncertainty. "Adelaide," he said, his voice rough, "I want you to know that we do not have to. That is, if you need more time, I can wait." Adelaide crossed the room to him, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She reached up and touched his face, feeling the scratch of his beard against her palm. "I do not need more time, Vernon. I am your wife now, and I want to be your wife in every way." Vernon's control seemed to slip at her words. He gathered her into his arms, and Adelaide was struck again by his sheer size and strength, by the way his body radiated warmth like a furnace. He kissed her deeply this time, with none of the careful restraint he had shown earlier, and Adelaide responded with equal passion, wrapping her arms around his neck and pressing herself against him. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, carrying her to the loft and laying her gently on the bed covered in soft furs and quilts. The lamplight cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn beams above them as Vernon stretched out beside her, his large frame dwarfing hers. He touched her reverently, as if learning the landscape of her body, and Adelaide did the same, tracing the hard muscles of his chest and arms, marveling at the differences between them. Their coming together was tender and passionate, awkward in moments as they learned each other's bodies, but also deeply right in a way that Adelaide had never expected. Vernon was careful with his strength, always watching her face to make sure he was not hurting her, and Adelaide found herself overwhelmed by the intimacy of it, by the vulnerability of sharing this with someone who was still in many ways a stranger, but who was also now the most important person in her world. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in the darkness, Vernon's heartbeat strong and steady beneath Adelaide's ear. His arm was wrapped around her, holding her close, and she felt safer than she had in years. "Are you all right?" Vernon asked quietly. "I am more than all right," Adelaide said. "I am happy." She felt him relax at that, and his arm tightened around her. "So am I, more than I ever thought I would be." They drifted off to sleep like that, wrapped in each other and in the quiet peace of the mountain night. The weeks that followed were a time of adjustment and discovery. Adelaide threw herself into making the cabin truly their home, sewing curtains for the windows and cushions for the chairs, planting herbs in pots on the porch, organizing Vernon's somewhat haphazard storage system into something more efficient. She was delighted to discover that the meadow below the cabin had rich soil, and she began planning the garden she would plant come spring. Vernon taught her to fish in the creek, to recognize edible plants in the forest, to shoot his rifle with reasonable accuracy. He was endlessly patient with her mistakes and genuinely impressed by her successes. Adelaide found herself falling into the rhythm of mountain life, rising with the sun, working hard through the day, falling into bed exhausted at night in Vernon's strong arms. But it was not all idyllic. There were challenges too. Adelaide struggled with the isolation at first, used to the constant bustle of city life, even if she had not particularly enjoyed it. There were days when the silence of the mountains felt oppressive, when she missed having another woman to talk to, when the weight of being so far from any help if something went wrong pressed down on her. Vernon had his own struggles. He had lived alone for so long that sharing space with another person, even one he loved, required adjustments he had not fully anticipated. He had to remember to talk about his plans instead of just disappearing into the woods for hours at a time. He had to learn to discuss decisions instead of simply making them, to consider Adelaide's opinions and feelings even when they differed from his own. They had their first real argument about a month after the wedding. Vernon had gone hunting and been gone overnight without telling Adelaide he might not return. She had spent a sleepless night imagining him injured or dead, and when he walked in the next morning with a deer carcass over his shoulders, she had exploded with anger and fear. "You cannot just disappear like that," she shouted, all the terror of the night pouring out as rage. "I thought something had happened to you. I thought you were hurt or worse." Vernon, surprised by her vehemence, tried to explain. "I was tracking the deer and it got late. I made camp for the night rather than risk the trail in the dark. I did not think—" "Exactly. You did not think. You did not think that I would worry, that I would be here alone, not knowing if you were coming back or if I should go looking for you or if I should ride to town for help." Adelaide was trembling now, and she hated the tears were streaming down her face, but she could not stop them. Vernon set down the deer and approached her carefully. "You are right. I am sorry, Adelaide. I have been alone so long that I forgot that someone cares whether I come home. I will not do that again, I promise you." Adelaide let him pull her into his arms, and she cried against his chest while he stroked her hair and murmured apologies. When she finally calmed, she pulled back to look up at him. "I was so scared," she whispered. "I have already lost everyone I loved. I cannot lose you too." "You will not," Vernon said fiercely. "I will be more careful. I will always tell you where I am going and when I expect to be back. And Adelaide, I am sorry, truly. I never wanted to frighten you." They worked through it, as they worked through other small conflicts and misunderstandings in those early months. Adelaide learned to speak up about her needs and fears instead of trying to be the perfect, uncomplaining wife. Vernon learned to communicate better, to remember that his actions affected someone else now. Slowly, steadily, they built something solid together. As summer turned to fall, the mountains transformed into a blaze of color. Adelaide had never seen anything so beautiful as the aspens turning gold against the deep green of the pines, and she spent hours sketching the views from the cabin, trying to capture the glory of it. Vernon came home one evening with an armful of wildflowers, looking sheepish. "I know they will die soon with the frost coming," he said, "but I thought you would like them while they last." Adelaide arranged them in a jar on the table and kissed him thoroughly. "They are perfect. Thank you." Vernon started teaching her how to prepare for winter cutting and stacking firewood, storing vegetables from her garden in the root cellar he had dug beneath the cabin, smoking and drying meat from his hunts, checking that all the chinks in the cabin walls were properly sealed. It was hard work, but Adelaide found satisfaction in it, in knowing that they were preparing together to survive the harsh months ahead. In October, they made a trip down to Winnetka to stock up on supplies they could not produce themselves: flour, salt, sugar, coffee, lamp oil. While Vernon dealt with the trader, Adelaide visited Martha at the general store. "Look at you," Martha said with a knowing smile. "Marriage agrees with you. You are glowing." Adelaide felt herself blush. "I am happy, happier than I ever expected to be." "And Vernon? He's treating you well?" "He's wonderful," Adelaide said. "Patient and kind, and yes, he treats me very well indeed." She paused, then added more quietly, "Martha, I think I might be pregnant." Martha's eyes widened with delight. "Oh, honey, that is wonderful. Have you told Vernon?" "Not yet. I'm not completely certain, but my courses are late and I have been feeling unwell in the mornings. I wanted to wait until I was sure before saying anything." Martha came around the counter and hugged her. "Well, when you are sure, that man is going to be over the moon. I can tell just by the way he looks at you that he will make a wonderful father." Adelaide carried the possibility of the pregnancy like a secret treasure as they rode back up the mountain. She watched Vernon as he rode ahead of her and tried to imagine him holding a baby, teaching a child to fish and hunt and love these mountains the way he did. The image made her smile. The first snow came in early November, and Adelaide woke to find the world transformed into something silent and white and magical. Vernon had warned her what winter would be like, but she had not fully understood until the snow kept falling day after day, until the drifts were taller than she was, and the trail down to Winnetka was completely impassable. They were truly isolated now, cut off from the rest of the world until spring. But instead of frightening Adelaide, she found a strange peace in it. The cabin was warm and well-stocked, and she had everything she needed right here, her husband, her home, and the growing certainty that she was carrying their child. She told Vernon one evening in December as they sat by the fire, his arm around her shoulders and a book of poetry open in her lap, though neither of them had been reading for some time. "Vernon, I need to tell you something." He looked down at her, concern flickering across his face. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong. Everything is right, actually." She took a deep breath. "I'm going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby." Vernon went completely still for a moment, and Adelaide felt a flutter of nervousness. Then his face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen, transforming his normally serious expression into something luminous with joy. "Truly? You are certain?" "As certain as I can be. The baby should come in early summer, I think." Vernon let out a whoop of joy and stood, pulling Adelaide to her feet and spinning her around despite her laughing protests to be careful. When he set her down, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with such tenderness that Adelaide felt tears spring to her eyes. "You have made me the happiest man alive," Vernon said, his voice thick with emotion. "A wife, and now a child. I never dared hope for so much." "Are you frightened?" Adelaide asked. "I confess I'm terrified. What if something goes wrong? We are so far from any doctor or midwife." Vernon's expression grew serious. "I will not lie to you. I am frightened too. But Martha has delivered several babies, and when the snow melts enough for us to get down to town, we will talk to her. She will help us, and she will know what you need to do to stay healthy. And Adelaide, whatever happens, we will face it together." That night, Vernon was even more gentle with her than usual, treating her as if she were made of glass. Adelaide finally had to laugh and tell him she was not going to break, that pregnancy was natural and she was strong. But she loved him all the more for his protectiveness, for the way his hand kept drifting to her still flat belly as if he could not quite believe there was a child growing there. Winter deepened, and the mountains were locked in ice and snow. Vernon kept them well supplied with fresh meat, going out on his snowshoes to hunt even in the worst weather. Adelaide worried every time he left, but he always came back, usually with game for their table and stories about what he had seen in the frozen wilderness. They spent long evenings by the fire, talking about the future. Vernon began carving a cradle from wood he had been saving, his large hands surprisingly dexterous as he shaped the rockers and slats. Adelaide sewed tiny clothes from fabric she had brought from Boston, marveling at how small they were, how impossible it seemed that a whole person could fit into such miniature garments. "What should we name the baby?" Vernon asked one night as he worked on the cradle. "I do not know," Adelaide said, looking up from her sewing. "I suppose it depends on whether we have a son or daughter. I would like to name a son after my father, if you would not mind. Victor. He was a good man, and I would like to honor his memory." "Victor Owens," Adelaide said, testing the name. "I like it. And for a girl, perhaps Victoria? Or would that be too similar?" Vernon smiled. "Victoria is lovely. But what about using your mother's name? What was it?" "Rose," Adelaide said softly. Her name was Rose. "Then Rose for a girl," Vernon decided. "Rose Owens. That is perfect." As winter slowly loosened its grip and the days began to lengthen, Adelaide's pregnancy became more obvious. Her belly swelled and she felt the first flutters of movement that took her breath away. Vernon was fascinated by it, pressing his hand to her stomach to feel the baby kick, his face filled with wonder. "There is a person in there," he would say amazed, "a whole person we made together." By late March, the snow had melted enough that Vernon was able to ride down to Winnetka. He brought Martha back with him, the older woman bundled in furs and riding behind Vernon on his horse. Martha examined Adelaide thoroughly, asking detailed questions and checking the baby's position. "You are healthy as a horse, and the baby seems to be doing well," Martha pronounced. "You've got maybe 2 more months, I would say. The baby is positioned right, and you have got good wide hips for birthing. I think you will be just fine." "But what if something goes wrong?" Adelaide asked, voicing the fear that had been growing as her due date approached. Martha took her hand. "I will not lie to you and say nothing could go wrong. Childbirth is dangerous, and that is just the truth of it. But you are young and strong and healthy, and those are all in your favor. When the time comes, Vernon will ride down and get me, and I will come up here and help you through it. I have delivered more babies than I can count, and I know what to do." Martha stayed for 2 days, teaching Vernon what signs to watch, for that would indicate Adelaide was going into labor, and what he should do until Martha could arrive. She left them with supplies and instructions, and a stern warning to Vernon to take good care of his wife. "I intend to," Vernon said seriously. "She is everything to me." April brought the first real warmth, and the meadow below the cabin began to green. Adelaide was huge now, her belly enormous, and she moved with the careful waddle of the very pregnant. Vernon helped her plant her garden, doing the heavy digging while she directed where everything should go and planted the seeds with her own hands. "Next year," she said, resting her hands on her aching back, "the baby will be old enough to come out here with us. We can lay a blanket in the shade and let the baby watch while we work." Vernon smiled at the image. I cannot wait to meet this child and see what kind of person we have created." The waiting was hard. Every day that passed felt like an eternity, and Adelaide felt ungainly and uncomfortable and ready to meet her baby. Vernon was unfailingly patient with her mood swings and complaints, rubbing her swollen feet each night and helping her maneuver her bulk up the ladder to the loft. Labor started on a warm morning in early June when the meadow was filled with wildflowers and the world smelled of pine and new growth. Adelaide woke to cramping pains that she tried to ignore at first, but they grew steadily stronger and more regular. By mid-morning, she had to admit what was happening. "Vernon," she called down from the loft, "I think it is time." She heard him drop whatever he was working on and climb the ladder so fast he nearly fell. "You are sure?" "I am sure. The pains are coming regularly now. You need to go get Martha." Vernon's face went pale. "I do not want to leave you alone." "I will be fine for a few hours." Martha said first babies take a long time. "Go now, quickly, and bring her back." Vernon hesitated only a moment more, then kissed her hard. "I will be as fast as I can. Do not have this baby without me." Adelaide managed a shaky laugh. "I will do my best." She listened to him thunder down the ladder and out the door, heard him saddling his horse and galloping away. Then she was alone with the pain, which was growing more intense with each contraction. She climbed carefully down from the loft and paced the cabin, trying to remember everything Martha had told her about breathing through the contractions and staying calm. Time became strange and slippery. Adelaide had no idea how long she paced and breathed and fought the rising panic that Vernon would not make it back in time. But eventually she heard horses outside, and then Martha was bustling through the door with Vernon close behind, both of them breathing hard from the fast ride. "All right, honey, let me look at you," Martha said, taking charge immediately. She examined Adelaide and nodded with satisfaction. "You're doing great. Still got a ways to go, but everything looks good." The hours that followed were the hardest of Adelaide's life. The pain was overwhelming, beyond anything she had imagined, and there were moments when she was certain she could not endure another second of it. But Martha was there with encouragement and instruction, and Vernon held her hand and let her squeeze it until she thought she might break his fingers. And somehow she found the strength to keep going. Night had fallen when Martha finally said, "All right, Adelaide, with the next contraction, I want you to push. Your baby is ready to be born." Adelaide pushed with every ounce of strength she had left, and after an eternity and an instant, she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby's first cry. Martha worked quickly, and then she was placing a squirming, wailing bundle into Adelaide's arms. "You have got a son," Martha said with a tired smile. "A big, healthy boy." Adelaide looked down at the tiny red face, the shock of dark hair, the little fists waving in outrage at being thrust into the world. "Hello, Victor," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Hello, my beautiful boy." Vernon was kneeling beside the bed, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he stared at his son. "He is perfect, Adelaide. He is absolutely perfect." Martha cleaned up and checked on Adelaide, declaring both mother and baby healthy. "I will stay the night just to make sure everything's all right, but you two did beautifully. You've got a fine, strong son there." Adelaide was exhausted beyond measure, but she could not stop staring at the baby in her arms. Victor had quieted now and was looking up at her with unfocused eyes that she thought might be gray like his father's. Vernon stretched out carefully beside her on the bed, and they lay there together, the three of them, as the mountain night settled around the cabin. "We made this," Vernon said softly, touching one tiny hand with his finger. Victor's fist closed around Vernon's finger with surprising strength. "This perfect little person." "I love you," Adelaide said, looking up at her husband. "I love you so much, Vernon. Thank you for bringing me here, for giving me this life." Vernon leaned down and kissed her gently. "I love you too, more than I have words for. You have given me everything I never dared dream of: a wife, a home, a family. You have made me whole." Martha left the next morning after showing Adelaide how to nurse the baby and checking one more time that everything was healing properly. "You did great," she told Adelaide. "You are going to be a wonderful mother. And Vernon, you come get me if anything seems wrong, you hear?" Vernon promised he would, and after Martha left, he and Adelaide settled into the exhausting, overwhelming, wonderful chaos of life with a newborn. Victor was a good baby, nursing well, and sleeping in reasonable stretches, but he was still a baby and demanded constant attention. Adelaide was sore and tired and had never been happier. Vernon was besotted with his son. He held Victor for hours, just staring at him in wonder, and when the baby cried, Vernon was up immediately to help. He changed diapers without complaint, walked the floor at night when Victor was fussy, and looked at his wife and son with an expression of such complete contentment that it made Adelaide's heart ache. As the summer progressed and Adelaide recovered her strength, they fell into a new rhythm. Adelaide would work in her garden with Victor sleeping in a basket nearby, or she would carry him in a sling while she did chores around the cabin. Vernon took his son with him on short walks around the property, pointing out trees and animals and telling Victor stories about the mountains, even though the baby was far too young to understand. "I want him to love this place the way I do," Vernon explained when Adelaide teased him about talking to a 3-month-old about the behavior of elk. "I want him to grow up knowing he is part of something bigger than himself." By fall, Victor was a chubby, happy baby who smiled and laughed and clearly adored both his parents. Adelaide loved watching Vernon with his son, seeing this huge, powerful man reduced to complete gentleness by a tiny child. Vernon would lie on the floor and let Victor crawl all over him, would make ridiculous faces to get the baby to laugh, would sing surprisingly sweet lullabies in his rough voice while rocking Victor to sleep. One evening in October, almost a year after Adelaide had told Vernon about her pregnancy, they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Victor was asleep in Vernon's arms, his small fist clutching his father's shirt, and Adelaide leaned against her husband's shoulder. Are you happy?" Vernon asked quietly. Adelaide thought about the question. She thought about the life she had left behind in Boston, about the fears she had carried with her on the stagecoach west, about the uncertainty of meeting Vernon for the first time in that dim saloon. She thought about all they had built together, the trust, the love, the partnership that had grown between them. She thought about their son sleeping peacefully, about the cabin that had become home, about the mountains that had stopped being frightening and become beloved. "I am more than happy," she said. "I am content. I am fulfilled. I am exactly where I am supposed to be." Vernon shifted Victor carefully so he could put his arm around Adelaide. "So am I. You know, when I placed that advertisement for a mail-order bride, I hoped for someone I could respect, someone I could build a life with. But I never imagined I would find you. I never imagined I could love someone this much." Adelaide tilted her face up and kissed him. "I'm glad I had my mother's ring to bring with me. It feels like she guided me here somehow, like she knew this was where I needed to be." Vernon touched the small gold band on his smallest finger, Adelaide's mother's ring, which he never took off. "I wear this every day to remind me of the trust you placed in me, the trust both of you placed in me, in a way. I promise I will never take that for granted." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Inside the cabin, the lamp burned warm and golden, and Adelaide could see her garden, now mostly harvested for winter, and the neat stacks of firewood Vernon had cut. Everything was ready for the cold months ahead, but Adelaide no longer feared winter. She had learned that there was a special kind of magic in being snowed in together, in the intimacy of those long, dark months when their world narrowed to just the three of them. Winter came again, as it always did in the mountains, and this time Adelaide welcomed it. Victor was old enough now to be more aware, and he loved watching the snow fall past the windows, his eyes wide with wonder. Vernon built up the fire each morning, and Adelaide would make breakfast while Vernon played with Victor, the baby's delighted giggles filling the cabin with joy. They celebrated Victor's first birthday in June with a cake Adelaide baked, and gifts Vernon had carved: a wooden horse, a ball, a set of blocks. Victor destroyed the cake with enthusiastic hands and laughed at everything, and Adelaide took a moment to step back and just watch her husband and son together, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "What are you thinking about?" Vernon asked, looking up from where he was helping Victor stack blocks. "Just how lucky I am," Adelaide said. "How lucky we all are." That night, after Victor was asleep in the cradle that would soon be too small for him, Adelaide and Vernon lay in bed talking about the future. "I think we should have more children," Vernon said, playing with a strand of Adelaide's hair. "Victor should have siblings. What do you think?" Adelaide smiled in the darkness. "I think that's a wonderful idea. I always wanted a big family." "How many?" "I do not know. As many as come, I suppose. 3, 4. We have the room and the love." Vernon pulled her closer. "Then let us work on giving Victor a little brother or sister." By the time Victor was 2, Adelaide was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect, or perhaps because she was too busy chasing after an active toddler to worry as much. Vernon was just as protective and excited as he had been the first time, and Victor seemed to sense something was different, frequently patting Adelaide's growing belly and babbling to it in his toddler language. Their daughter Rose was born on a crisp autumn morning, smaller than Victor had been, but just as healthy, with Adelaide's dark hair and what looked like it might be her blue eyes. Victor was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything, and Vernon walked around with an expression of dazed happiness at now having 2 children. "Our family is growing," he said, holding Rose while Victor leaned against his leg. "This is everything I wanted, everything and more." Life fell into a beautiful pattern over the next few years. Adelaide's garden flourished, providing more vegetables than they could use, so they traded the surplus in town. Vernon's trapping and hunting continued to be successful, and they were comfortable, if not wealthy. More importantly, they were happy. The cabin echoed with children's laughter as Victor and Rose played together, and Adelaide and Vernon's love deepened and matured into something solid and enduring. When Rose was 3 and Victor was 5, Adelaide became pregnant again. This time, she gave birth to twins, another boy and another girl. They named the boy Vincent and the girl Ruby. And suddenly, the cabin felt much smaller and much louder, and Adelaide wondered how she had ever thought life was busy with just 2 children. But Vernon was an amazing father, patient and playful, and endlessly creative in keeping 4 children entertained. He built them toys and told them stories, and took them on adventures around the property, teaching them about the mountains and animals and plants. Adelaide watched him with their children and fell in love with him over and over again. On a summer evening when Victor was 10, Rose was 8, and the twins were 5, the whole family sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the meadow below. The children were tired and quiet for once, and Vernon had his arm around Adelaide's shoulders. "Do you remember the day we met?" Adelaide asked quietly. "Every detail," Vernon said. "You stepped out of that stagecoach looking terrified and determined, and I thought you were the bravest person I had ever seen, coming all this way to marry a stranger." "I was terrified," Adelaide admitted, "but I was also desperate for a different life, and look what I found." She gestured to their children, to the cabin behind them, to the mountains rising majestically in the distance. Vernon looked at her with those storm-gray eyes that still made her breath catch after all these years. "Wear it on our wedding day," Vernon said softly, echoing his words from so long ago. That's what I told you about your mother's ring. Do you remember? Of course I remember. It is one of my favorite memories. Vernon touched the ring on his finger. I wear it every day to remind me of that moment when I realized what an incredible gift you were bringing to my life. Not just the ring, but yourself, your trust, your courage, your love. Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes. And you have honored that gift every single day since. You have given me a life beyond my wildest dreams, Vernon. You have given me love and safety and these beautiful children and a home in these mountains that I have come to love as much as you do. Victor, their eldest, spoke up from where he was lying on the porch looking at the stars. Tell us the story again about how you met Papa. Adelaide laughed. You have heard it 100 times. But I like it, Victor insisted. Rose and the twins chorused their agreement. So Adelaide told them again about the stagecoach and the dusty town and the mountain man who had promised to respect her, about the mother's ring and Vernon's words about wearing it on their wedding day, about falling in love in a cabin in the mountains. The children listened raptly, even though they knew the story by heart, and when she finished, Rose asked the question she always asked. And then you lived happily ever after, right, Mama? Adelaide looked at Vernon, at their 4 children, at the home they had built together through hard work and dedication and love. She thought about all the years behind them and all the years ahead, about growing old together in these mountains they both loved, about watching their children grow and have children of their own. Yes, sweetheart, Adelaide said, her voice full of contentment. We are living happily ever after, every single day. As darkness fell and Vernon carried the sleepy twins inside while Rose and Victor followed, Adelaide took one last look at the mountains silhouetted against the starlit sky. She touched the simple gold band on her left hand, the ring Vernon had given her on their wedding day, and smiled. She had come west looking for freedom and found something far more precious. She had found home. She had found love. She had found a life more fulfilling than anything she had ever imagined in those lonely days in Boston. And in the morning, she would wake beside Vernon in the bed they shared, and the children would thunder down from the loft in the sleeping area Vernon had built when the family outgrew the original space, and she would make breakfast while Vernon fed the chickens they had acquired a few years back. And life would continue in all its messy, beautiful, ordinary glory. This was her happily ever after, Adelaide thought, as she went inside and climbed the ladder to where Vernon was already settling into bed. Not a fairy tale ending, but something real and earned and all the more precious for it. She curled up against her husband's solid warmth, listened to the quiet breathing of their children, and let herself drift off to sleep with a smile on her face and her mother's ring. Now Vernon's ring catching the moonlight from the window, a symbol of love passed down and love newly made, a circle unbroken. Years continued to pass in their mountain home, each season bringing its own rhythm and challenges. Victor grew into a strong young man who inherited his father's size and his mother's quick mind. Rose became a skilled botanist, helping Adelaide expand her garden into something that provided not just food, but medicinal herbs that they shared with the community in Winnetka. The twins, Vincent and Ruby, were inseparable and adventurous, keeping their parents constantly on their toes with their explorations and schemes. When Victor was 16, he began courting the daughter of a rancher whose property bordered the lower reaches of Vernon's mountain territory. Adelaide watched her eldest son fall in love and remembered her own journey from uncertainty to happiness. Vernon gave Victor advice about treating women with respect and being patient, and Adelaide saw how her husband's wisdom had grown over the years. Rose showed no interest in marriage yet, declaring she was far too busy with her plans to worry about boys, though Adelaide suspected that would change eventually. The twins were still young enough that such concerns were years away, though both showed signs of their father's love for the mountains and their mother's intellectual curiosity. Vernon's hair had begun to show threads of silver, and Adelaide found she loved him more with each passing year. He was still strong and capable, still protective of his family, but age had gentled him in some ways, made him more contemplative. He still trapped and hunted, but he had begun teaching Victor and Vincent his skills, preparing them to carry on if anything should happen to him. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Vernon surprised Adelaide with a trip down to Winnetka, just the two of them, leaving the children in Rose's capable care. They stayed at the boarding house that had been built a few years earlier, had dinner at the restaurant that now existed where the saloon used to be, and walked through the town that had grown considerably since the day Adelaide had first arrived. "Do you ever regret it?" Vernon asked as they walked hand in hand down the main street in the twilight. "Leaving Boston for this life?" Adelaide stopped and turned to face him. At 42, she had lines around her eyes from years of smiling and laugh lines bracketing her mouth. Her dark hair had a few streaks of gray, and her hands were work-roughened from years of tending her garden and caring for her family. She had never felt more beautiful or more content. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "Every choice I made led me to you, to our children, to the life we have built. I would make the same choice again in a heartbeat." Vernon cupped her face in his hands, those large, calloused hands that had held her with such tenderness for 20 years. "I love you, Adelaide Owens, more than I did on our wedding day, which I would not have thought possible." "I love you too," Adelaide said, "always." They went back to the boarding house and made love like the young couple they had once been, though with an ease and familiarity that only decades together could bring. The next morning, they rode back up to their cabin, to their children and their life, both of them content and deeply happy. The years rolled on. Victor married his rancher's daughter in a beautiful ceremony held in the meadow below the cabin, with half the territory in attendance. Adelaide cried happy tears as she watched her son pledge his life to the woman he loved, and Vernon stood tall and proud beside her. Within a year, they had their first grandchild, a boy that Victor named Vernon after his father, and Adelaide watched her strong mountain man husband hold his tiny grandson with tears streaming down his face. Rose eventually did fall in love, to a traveling doctor who was setting up a practice in Winnetka. She married him and moved to town, but visited often, bringing new herbs for Adelaide's garden and stories about her work helping her husband with his patients. Vincent and Ruby both stayed on the mountain, building their own cabins nearby and continuing the family tradition of living close to the land. By the time Adelaide and Vernon celebrated their 30th anniversary, they had 7 grandchildren with more on the way. The cabin had been expanded several times over the years and now sprawled across the clearing, though Adelaide and Vernon still slept in the original loft where they had begun their marriage and where each of their children had been conceived. They were sitting on the porch one autumn evening, watching the sunset and holding hands like they had done thousands of times before, when Vernon said something that surprised Adelaide. "I want to renew our vows." Adelaide looked at him. "What?" "I want to renew our wedding vows. Have another ceremony here at the cabin with all the children and grandchildren present. I want to stand up in front of everyone who matters and pledge myself to you again. What do you think?" Adelaide felt warmth spread through her chest. "I think that is the most romantic thing you have ever said, and yes, I would love that." They held the ceremony on a perfect October day, when the aspens were golden and the sky was impossibly blue. Their children and grandchildren gathered in the meadow, along with Martha and her husband, who were elderly, now but still going strong, and other friends from Winnetka who had become family over the years. The same Reverend Walters, who had married them 30 years earlier, now wizened with age, presided over the renewal of their vows. Adelaide wore a new dress that Rose had made for her, but around her neck on a chain was her mother's original ring, the one Vernon had worn for 30 years but had returned to her that morning with a kiss and a request that she wear it for the ceremony. Vernon wore his wedding band and looked distinguished with his silver-streaked hair and weathered face, still strong and solid after all these years. "I, Vernon Owens, take you, Adelaide Emerson Owens, to be my wife again and always," Vernon said, his voice carrying across the meadow. 30 years ago, I promised to honor and cherish you, to build a life with you, to love you with everything I had. I've kept that promise every day since, and I renew it now in front of our children and their children. You are my heart, my home, my everything. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." Adelaide was crying as she spoke her own vows. "I, Adelaide Emerson Owens, take you, Vernon Owens, to be my husband again and always. You gave me freedom when I thought I was trapped. You gave me love when I thought I would never find it. You gave me this life that has exceeded every dream I ever had. You are my partner, my protector, my greatest love. I will love you forever and always." They kissed as the sun set behind the mountains, and their family cheered and applauded. It was a beginning and an ending, a celebration of everything they had built and a promise of all that was still to come. They had a feast that lasted into the night, with music and dancing and stories. Victor told his children about growing up in the mountains. Rose spoke about her mother's wisdom with herbs and healing. The twins shared adventures from their childhood that made Vernon shake his head in remembered exasperation, and Adelaide laugh until she cried. The grandchildren ran around in the twilight, playing the same games their parents had played in this same meadow years before. When everyone had finally left or settled into the various cabins and rooms for the night, Adelaide and Vernon climbed up to their loft. Vernon helped Adelaide out of her dress with the same gentle care he had shown on their wedding night 30 years earlier, and Adelaide traced the lines of his face with her fingers, memorizing features she already knew by heart. "Thank you," Vernon said softly, "for saying yes to a stranger's advertisement all those years ago, for trusting me, for building this life with me, for giving me everything." "Thank you," Adelaide replied, "for seeing me as a partner, not a possession, for loving me, for giving me this family and this home and this beautiful life in these mountains, for being everything I did not know I needed." They made love slowly and tenderly, a reaffirmation of vows spoken and unspoken, of love tested by time and found true. Afterwards, they lay wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the night sounds of the mountains and the soft breathing of their family, sleeping in the rooms below and in the cabins nearby. "Are you happy?" Vernon asked, echoing the question he had asked so many times over the years. "I am so happy I cannot find words for it," Adelaide said. "This life, this family, you, it is all more than I ever imagined possible. I am blessed beyond measure." "So am I," Vernon said, holding her closer. "So am I." They drifted off to sleep together, as they had every night for 30 years, as they would every night for all the years to come. Outside, the mountains stood eternal under the stars, and inside, two people who had started as strangers and become soulmates slept peacefully, surrounded by the family they had created and the love they had nurtured into something unbreakable. The seasons continued their eternal dance, and Adelaide and Vernon grew older together with grace and contentment. They saw more grandchildren born, and eventually great-grandchildren, their family tree spreading wide and deep across the mountain territory. Victor took over more of the hunting and trapping as Vernon's joints grew stiff with age, though the old mountain man still insisted on going out on occasion, needing the wilderness that had always been part of his soul. Rose's husband, the doctor, kept them all healthy, and Adelaide's herbal knowledge complemented his medical training beautifully. Between them, they helped establish a small hospital in Winnetka that served the growing community. Adelaide spent her later years teaching Rose and her daughters about plants and healing, passing down knowledge that would continue long after she was gone. Vernon taught his sons and grandsons everything he knew about surviving and thriving in the mountains, about reading weather and tracking animals and living in harmony with the wild. He taught them about respect for nature, for women, for the land that provided for them. He was a wise and beloved patriarch, and when the family gathered for holidays and celebrations, he would sit at the head of the table with Adelaide beside him, both of them watching their legacy with satisfied smiles. On their 40th anniversary, they were too old for grand ceremonies, but their children threw them a party at the cabin anyway. Adelaide was 62 now, and Vernon was 68, both of them slowed by age, but still sharp-minded and deeply in love. They sat on the porch in the rocking chairs Vernon had built years ago and watched their family celebrate around them. "Do you remember," Adelaide said softly, "what you told me about my mother's ring when we first met?" Vernon smiled, touching the ring that he had begun wearing again years ago when Adelaide had insisted she preferred seeing it on his hand. "Wear it on our wedding day. Yes, I remember. That was the moment I knew I could love you, when I saw what that ring meant to you and wanted to honor that." "It was the moment I started falling in love with you too," Adelaide admitted. "Your kindness toward something that mattered to me. Your understanding that some things are beyond price." Vernon took her hand, and they sat together watching the party, watching their family, watching the sunset over the mountains they had called home for 40 years. They did not talk much after 4 decades together. They did not need to. Everything that mattered had already been said in 1,000 different ways over the years. As the years continued to pass and they both grew older and more frail, Adelaide and Vernon faced the reality that their time together was not infinite. But instead of mourning what would inevitably come, they chose to treasure each day, each moment. They still sat on the porch together every evening, weather permitted. They still held hands. They still said, "I love you," multiple times a day. They still looked at each other with eyes full of affection and contentment. Vernon passed peacefully in his sleep when he was 74, lying beside Adelaide in the loft where they had spent nearly every night of their marriage. Adelaide woke to find him gone, and though her heart shattered at the loss, she also felt a deep gratitude for the years they had been given. She held his hand and told him one last time that she loved him, that he had made her life beautiful, that she would carry him in her heart until they met again. The funeral was held in the meadow, and it seemed like half the territory came to pay their respects to the mountain man who had been a good husband, a wonderful father, and a pillar of their community. Adelaide stood beside her children as Vernon was laid to rest on a hillside overlooking the valley he had loved, and she wore both wedding rings, hers and her mother's, as a symbol of love passed down and love eternal. Adelaide lived another 5 years after Vernon's death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She spent those years putting her affairs in order, writing down family histories and recipes and herbal knowledge, making sure that everything she and Vernon had built would continue. She never left the cabin, never wanted to. It was where her heart lived, where every corner held memories of Vernon and their life together. When Adelaide's time came, she passed quietly in her sleep, just as Vernon had, lying in the loft bed where they had shared so much love. Her children found her in the morning with a peaceful smile on her face, one hand pressed to her heart where she had worn her mother's ring and Vernon's ring on a chain beneath her nightgown. They buried her beside Vernon on the hillside, and the entire territory mourned the loss of the mail-order bride who had come west on a leap of faith and built a dynasty of love. The cabin remained in the family for generations, passing down through Victor's line and becoming something of a sacred place where family would gather for reunions and celebrations. The garden Adelaide had started flourished under the care of her descendants, and Vernon's teachings about living in harmony with the mountains continued to guide the family's way of life. And on a shelf inside the cabin, in a place of honor, sat a small glass case containing 2 rings, a simple gold band with a sapphire stone that had belonged to Adelaide's mother, and a plain gold band that Vernon had worn for 44 years. Beside them was a letter written in Adelaide's elegant hand in the last weeks of her life, telling the story of 2 strangers who had become soulmates, of a mail-order bride and a mountain man, of a love that had started with a kind word about a precious ring and grown into something that transcended death itself. The letter ended with these words: "If you are reading this, you are one of our descendants, and you carry within you the love that Vernon and I built. Remember that love is not found, it is built, day by day, through kindness and respect and partnership. Remember that some things are worth more than money or gold, family, loyalty, the simple joys of a life well lived. Remember that courage sometimes means taking a leap of faith, getting on a stagecoach to meet a stranger, or placing an advertisement hoping someone will answer. Remember us, and know that our love continues in you. Be brave, be kind, be true. And may you know the happiness that your ancestor, the mail-order bride, and her mountain man found together in these beautiful mountains." And so the story of Adelaide and Vernon lived on, passed down through generations as a testament to the power of love, courage, and the choices that define our lives. The mountains stood eternal, and the family they had created flourished, and their love story became legend, a reminder that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a single step into the unknown. And the greatest love stories are built not on grand gestures, but on daily acts of kindness, respect, and devotion. In the end, Adelaide and Vernon had found exactly what they had been looking for when they wrote and answered that advertisement so many years ago. They had found partnership and respect. They had found love and family. They had found home. And they had proven that a mail-order bride and a mountain man could build something precious and lasting, something that would echo through the generations long after they were gone. Their happily ever after was not a fairy tale ending, but something better. It was a life well lived, a love well tended, a family well loved. And in the mountains they had called home, their legacy continued, as eternal as the peaks themselves, as constant as the stars above, as enduring as true love always is.